She doesn't need anything, my sister said, smiling as if she were doing me a favor. Dakota's always been fine on her own. A few people chuckled. Not loudly, not cruelly, just enough to let me know they agreed. I stood there in the middle of my father's living room, surrounded by people who had watched me grow up, people who had just come from his funeral, still dressed in black, still holding half-empty glasses of water and polite sympathy. The air smelled like lilies and stale coffee. My name had just been reduced to a footnote in a conversation about inheritance, and no one thought it was strange. Vanessa didn't even look at me when she said it. She was standing near the window, one hand resting lightly on the stack of documents she had brought, the other holding her phone like she was waiting for something more important to happen. Her posture was calm, composed, practiced, like this was already finished. "She'll understand," she added, almost gently this time, as if she were explaining me to them, not talking about me. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I just nodded once, like everything she said made sense, like I agreed with the version of me she had just created in that room. Then I picked up my coat, thanked the neighbors for coming, and stepped outside into the dry Arizona heat. Because if I had stayed another minute, I might have said something too early. And for the first time in my life, I knew timing mattered more than being right. The gravel crunched under my shoes as I walked down the driveway, the sound sharp against the quiet street. It had been years since I'd been back here, and nothing felt familiar anymore. Not the house, not the town, not even the version of myself they all seemed so sure they understood. I had built a life in Seattle that didn't need their approval, didn't depend on their version of me. But standing there, just hours after burying my father, I realized something I hadn't expected. I had still trusted them. That was my first mistake. The next morning, Vanessa handed me a folder. "Just sign these," she said casually, placing it on the kitchen counter like it was nothing more than a routine errand. "It's just to finalize everything." I didn't open it right away. I watched her instead. The way she avoided eye contact, the way she busied herself with pouring coffee she didn't drink, the way her voice stayed just a little too even. "What's in it?" I asked. "Probate paperwork," she replied quickly. "Standard stuff, it'll make things easier." Easier for who? I didn't ask. I flipped through the pages slowly, letting my eyes scan the legal language without reacting. My name appeared once, then disappeared. By the final page, it was gone completely. Vanessa Cole listed as sole owner. I felt something shift, not sharply, not dramatically, but enough to change how everything in that room looked. The cabinets, the counters, the familiar corners of a house that suddenly felt staged, like I was standing inside a version of reality someone else had written. "You said Dad wanted it split," I said quietly. Vanessa shrugged, taking a slow sip of her coffee. "He said a lot of things," she replied. "Nothing was finalized. That land was supposed to be for both of us." "It's not worth anything, Dakota," she cut in, her tone tightening just slightly. "It's basically sentimental. You're not losing anything real." "Not losing anything." I nodded again, folding the papers neatly and placing them back on the counter. "Okay," I said. "I'll look it over." She relaxed at that, just a little. It was subtle, but I saw it. The release of tension, the quiet confirmation that I wasn't going to push back. Not now. That was her second mistake. Later that afternoon, I drove out to the land. It sat just beyond the edge of town, dry and open, stretching out beside an old industrial zone that looked like it had been abandoned years ago. Rusted fencing, cracked pavement, nothing about it suggested value. Nothing about it explained why my father had been so certain it mattered. I stepped out of the car and let the silence settle around me. No traffic, no voices, just wind moving through empty space. For a moment, I almost believed her. That it was nothing, that I was holding on to a memory that didn't translate into reality. Then I noticed the markers. Small, bright flags staked into the ground in clean, deliberate lines. Too precise to be random, too recent to be forgotten. I walked closer, crouching slightly to get a better look. Survey markings, official ones. I straightened slowly, my gaze moving across the horizon, taking in details I hadn't paid attention to before. The distance to the highway, the positioning of the land, the quiet sense that something here was about to change. Back in the car, I pulled out my phone and searched the county planning database. It didn't take long. A new logistics corridor, highway expansion, industrial redevelopment, all approved, all scheduled, all directly connected to this area. I read the documents twice, then a third time, each line settling deeper than the last. Projected value increase, multiple phases, private investment interest. I leaned back in the seat, staring out at the land again, seeing it differently now. Not as empty space, but as something positioned, something timed, something someone had been waiting for. Vanessa said it wasn't worth anything, but she had made sure it was hers. And in that moment, standing between what she told me and what I was starting to see, one question rose to the surface, clear and unavoidable. If this land meant nothing, why did she need me out of it so badly? I didn't confront her that night. Instead, I sat at the kitchen table and let her talk. Vanessa moved through the house like nothing had changed, like the conversation from that morning had already been resolved. She made dinner she barely touched, checked her phone between sentences, and filled the silence with casual plans about selling the land, eventually. Not now, she said. No rush. Maybe in a year or two if the market shifted. It all sounded reasonable, measured, like someone thinking long-term. But that wasn't what I had just seen. If it's not worth much, I asked lightly, keeping my tone neutral, why not just hold on to it together? She didn't look at me right away, just a slight pause, barely noticeable unless you were paying attention. Because it's simpler this way, she replied, turning back to the sink. Less paperwork, less back and forth. You live in Seattle, it's not practical. Practical, I nodded like I agreed. Like I hadn't just read county filings that turned nothing into something worth millions. Like I hadn't seen the survey markers cutting across that land with quiet precision. She kept talking, explaining details I hadn't asked for. Taxes, maintenance, future options. The more she spoke, the clearer it became. She wasn't just comfortable, she was certain that I believed her, certain that I wouldn't look deeper. That certainty settled into the room like a second layer of air, and I let it. Later that night, when the house finally went quiet, I opened my laptop and went back to the database. This time, I wasn't just scanning for information. I was looking for connections, ownership records, zoning updates, commercial filings tied to upcoming developments. It didn't take long before something surfaced, a transaction log linked to the property, not completed, pending. I clicked into the record, my eyes moving slowly across the details. A deposit agreement, multi-million-dollar valuation, conditional terms tied to future development approval. I leaned closer to the screen, reading each line carefully until I reached the clause that made everything stop. Full ownership required prior to execution. I read it again, then once more. Because sometimes the smallest sentence carries the entire truth. This wasn't a shared deal. It couldn't be. Whoever signed that agreement needed complete control of the land before anything else could move forward. I sat back in my chair, the shape of the situation shifting into something clearer, sharper, impossible to ignore. Vanessa didn't remove my name to simplify things. She removed it because she had to, because without that condition being met, the entire contract would collapse. And contracts like this don't appear by accident. They're planned, timed, built around information not everyone has. I scrolled further, looking for dates. The deposit had been filed just days before the probate paperwork was submitted. Not after. Before. My hand hovered over the trackpad for a second longer than necessary as I processed what that meant. She hadn't acted early. She had acted on schedule. I opened another window and cross-referenced the development timeline with the filing dates. The alignment was too clean to ignore. Every step matched. Every action placed exactly where it needed to be to satisfy the contract. This wasn't opportunity. This was coordination. I stared at the screen, feeling something settle in my chest. Not anger, not even shock. Clarity. Because once you see the pattern, you can't unsee it. And once you understand the pattern, the question changes. It's no longer about what happened. It's about who knew it would happen. The next morning, I brought it up again. Carefully, Not as an accusation, as curiosity. If the land's not worth anything, I said, pouring coffee into a mug I didn't plan to drink, why rush the paperwork so fast? Vanessa didn't hesitate. Because dragging it out costs money, she replied smoothly. Lawyers, fees. It's easier to just finalize things. Her answer was clean. Prepared. Too prepared. I watched her for a moment, just long enough to see the slight tightening in her shoulders before she turned away. It was subtle. But once you know what someone is hiding, even the smallest reactions start to feel loud. I didn't push further. I didn't need to, because I wasn't trying to catch her in a lie anymore. I was trying to understand the structure behind it. That afternoon, I stepped outside and made a call. Not to confront, not to accuse, to confirm. Because whatever this was, it was bigger than a conversation across a kitchen counter. And for the first time since I came back to this town, I wasn't reacting to what Vanessa had already done. I was starting to move ahead of it. Her name was Evelyn Carter, and she didn't waste time with small talk. "Tell me what you have," she said the moment I sat down across from her desk. I slid the folder toward her, keeping my hand on it for a second longer than necessary before letting go. Inside were the documents I had gathered. Probate filings, property records, the partial contract. Everything I could access without raising questions. She opened it without reacting, flipping through each page slowly, her expression steady, unreadable. No nods, no frowns, just quiet focus. "I'm not here to guess," she added calmly. "I'm here to verify." I nodded once, then verify it. She didn't respond to that. She just kept reading. Minutes passed, the kind that stretch when you're waiting for someone else to confirm what you already feel but can't yet prove. I watched her pause at certain sections. The ownership transfer, the missing name, the conditional clause in the contract. When she reached that line, she stopped. Not dramatically, just enough. "This," she said, tapping the page lightly, "is where things stop being routine." I leaned forward slightly, not speaking. "Full ownership required prior to execution," she read aloud, then looked up at me. "That's not a flexible condition." "No," I said quietly. "It's not." She nodded once, then turned to the next page. "Do you know who drafted this agreement?" she asked. "No." "Do you know when it was first introduced?" "Only what I could find in the filing records, a few days before the probate transfer." She set the paper down, folding her hands lightly on top of the folder. "Then your sister didn't act early," she said. "She acted on schedule." The words landed exactly the way I had already begun to understand them. "Which means?" I asked. "Which means someone gave her a timeline," Evelyn replied, "and she followed it." Silence settled between us for a moment, not uncomfortable, just precise, like we had both reached the same point from different directions. "Is it enough?" I asked. She shook her head slightly. "Not yet." I didn't feel disappointment. I expected that. "This shows motive," she continued, "possibly coordination, but it doesn't establish intent in a way that holds up on its own." "So what does?" "Connection," she said simply, "between the contract, the filing, and the decision to exclude you." I leaned back slightly, letting that settle. "And if we find that?" "Then it stops being a misunderstanding," she said, "and starts becoming something else." She didn't say the word. She didn't need to. Fraud, manipulation, intentional exclusion. It was all there, just waiting to be structured. Evelyn closed the folder and slid it back toward me. "Before we move forward," she added, "you need to understand something." I met her gaze. "This won't be quick," she said. "And it won't be clean. Once you file, there's no stepping back into a quiet resolution." "I'm not looking for quiet," I replied. She studied me for a moment, like she was measuring whether I meant that. Then she nodded. "Good," she said, "because your sister already chose noise." The next few hours weren't dramatic. No sudden breakthroughs, no immediate answers, just process, requests filed, access permissions initiated, legal pathways opened carefully, one step at a time. Evelyn outlined everything in clear terms. We would obtain communication logs tied to the probate submission. We would analyze document metadata. We would identify any third-party connections linked to the contract. Nothing rushed, Nothing assumed, everything verified. As she spoke, I realized something I hadn't felt since I walked back into that house. Control, not over the situation, over how I moved through it. When I left her office, the sun was lower, casting long shadows across the parking lot. I stood there for a moment, keys in hand, letting the quiet settle in again. Because for the first time, the story wasn't just happening to me. I was starting to shape it. That night, I didn't go back to the house right away. Instead, I sat in my car with my laptop open, reviewing the notes Evelyn had given me. A list of things to watch for, patterns, gaps, inconsistencies that don't announce themselves unless you're looking directly at them. I went back through the records again, slower this time, not searching for something obvious, looking for something hidden in plain sight. That's when I saw it. A name, not highlighted, not emphasized, just there, attached to a communication thread tied to the contract discussion. I had seen it before, but not like this. I clicked into the reference, pulling up everything connected to it. A consultant, listed in development meetings tied to the logistics project, not directly linked to the probate, not officially connected to Vanessa, but present in both places. I stared at the screen, the connections settling into place with quiet certainty. This wasn't just internal. It extended beyond her, beyond the house, beyond the story she had told everyone in that room. I closed the laptop slowly, the realization clear and steady. Vanessa hadn't just taken advantage of an opportunity. She had stepped into something that was already moving, and now, so had I. I didn't call her out. Instead, I sat across from Vanessa the next morning and let her believe nothing had changed. She moved through breakfast like the day before, controlled and efficient, her phone never far from reach. There was a lightness to her tone now, a quiet confidence that came from thinking the hardest part was already over. She talked about small things, neutral things, the kind of details people use to make everything feel normal again. I matched it. Nods where they were expected, silence where it was easier, and questions that sounded harmless. "If it's just sentimental," I said, stirring coffee I didn't drink, "why not wait a few months before deciding anything?" She shrugged, not even looking up. "Because waiting doesn't change anything," she replied. "It's just land." Just land. I let that sit between us, then gave a small, almost absent-minded nod. "Right," I said. She relaxed again. That was the pattern now. Every time I didn't push, she leaned further into her version of the story. Every time I stayed quiet, she spoke more freely, and every word she gave me filled in a piece she didn't realize I was collecting. Later that afternoon, I went back through the documents Evelyn had helped me access. This time, I focused on communication logs tied to the probate submission. Not just what was said, but how it was said. Tone, timing, language that reveals more than it intends to. At first, everything looked standard. Formal emails, confirmation messages, routine exchanges between Vanessa and the attorney who handled the filing. But when I slowed down and read each message carefully, something started to shift. Vanessa wasn't asking questions. She was directing outcomes, short sentences, clear instructions, minimal room for interpretation. And then I found it, a single line buried in a longer thread. "We need to finalize before any additional parties are involved." I read it twice, then again. It didn't mention me by name. It didn't have to. The meaning was already there. This wasn't about efficiency. This was about exclusion. I sent the entire thread to Evelyn. Her response came back quickly. "This supports intent," she wrote. "Keep building." So I did. I moved into the documents themselves next. Not the content this time, but the structure behind them. Metadata, file histories, edit timestamps. The version of the will attached to the probate filing had been modified, not rewritten, adjusted. Small changes, precise ones. The kind that don't draw attention unless you're looking for them. But I was. And the timestamps didn't align with anything Vanessa had said. The final version of that document didn't exist when my father signed his last official paperwork months earlier, which meant something had been changed after. Quietly, deliberately. I didn't react. I saved everything. Organized it. Labeled each file, each timestamp, each detail in a way that made the pattern clearer every time I looked at it. Evelyn reviewed it all that evening. "This is good," she said during our call, "but it still needs connection." "Between what and what?" I asked. "Between action and intent," she replied. "Right now, we can show irregularities. We need to show purpose." I understood. And then something else surfaced. The same name I had noticed the night before. This time, it wasn't just attached to a meeting reference. It appeared in a communication chain tied to the contract. Not directly, not obviously, but enough. A consultant, present in development planning, also present in correspondence connected to the deal Vanessa was trying to secure. I cross-referenced everything again, slower this time. The timing, the overlap, the quiet alignment between internal decisions and external opportunity. It wasn't coincidence, it was coordination. I leaned back, letting the realization settle in fully. Vanessa hadn't created this situation. She had stepped into it, followed it, used it. And if that was true, then the pressure wasn't just coming from her, it was coming from somewhere else. Somewhere with expectations, deadlines, consequences for failure. That explained the urgency, the precision, the way she had moved without hesitation. She wasn't just trying to take something, she was trying to meet a condition. That night, I walked past my father's old room without going in. The door was slightly open, the same way it had been since the day we lost him. I stopped for a moment, my hand resting lightly on the frame. There was still something there. Something I hadn't looked at yet. Not because it wasn't important, because I wasn't ready. But readiness doesn't wait forever. And neither does timing. I pushed the door open slowly and stepped inside. The air was still, unchanged. His desk exactly where he left it, his belongings untouched. I moved carefully, not searching yet, just letting the space speak in the way familiar places do when no one has disturbed them. And then I saw it. His old phone, sitting in the corner of the desk, forgotten, or maybe just overlooked. I picked it up slowly, turning it over in my hand. There was no password, no lock, just a device holding whatever he hadn't had the chance to say out loud. I hesitated for a moment, then pressed the power button. Because if everything else had been planned this carefully, there was a chance he had left something behind. And if he had, that might be the one thing Vanessa couldn't control. I stopped looking for proof and started building a sequence. Evelyn had said it clearly. Evidence on its own doesn't win anything. It has to connect. It has to form a chain that doesn't break under pressure. So I went back to the beginning again, not to question what happened, but to reconstruct how it happened step by step. The first action, the first decision, the moment everything shifted from opportunity into intent. The request for full communication logs went through faster than I expected. When the files came in, I didn't open them all at once. I went through them slowly, one thread at a time, reading not just the content but the rhythm. Who spoke first? Who followed? Who pushed? Vanessa wasn't reacting in those emails. She was directing. There were no uncertainties in her language, no hesitation, just short, controlled instructions, each one moving the process forward without pause. It wasn't how someone handles routine paperwork. It was how someone moves toward a deadline they already understand. Then I saw it again, the same line. We need to finalize before any additional parties are involved. It sat there in the middle of a longer message, quiet and unremarkable unless you knew what to look for. I read it again, slower this time, letting the implications settle fully. She didn't say my name, but she didn't need to. I forwarded everything to Evelyn. Her reply came back within minutes. "This establishes direction," she wrote. "Now we need to lock in intent." So I kept going. The next layer came from the documents themselves, not the visible content, the hidden structure behind them, metadata, edit histories, file origins. The will attached to the probate filing had been modified, subtly, deliberately, the kind of change designed to pass unnoticed. But the timestamps told a different story. The final version of that document didn't exist when my father signed his last official paperwork. It appeared later, close to the filing date, close to the contract timeline, too close. I didn't react, I saved everything, organized it, labeled each detail in a way that made the pattern clearer every time I reviewed it. Evelyn confirmed what I already knew. "This supports manipulation," she said, but we still need something that shows awareness." "Awareness of what?" I asked. "Of what she was doing," she replied. "Not just that it happened, that she knew it mattered." That's when I went back into my father's room. The phone was still where I had left it. I picked it up again, this time without hesitation, and scrolled through the contents more carefully. Messages, notes, old reminders. Most of it was exactly what you'd expect. Ordinary, familiar. Then I found the recording. No label, no explanation, just a timestamp from a few days before he died. I held my breath for a second before pressing play. His voice filled the room, steady but tired. He was talking about the land, about both daughters, about making sure it stayed equal, about not letting anything change what had already been decided. I closed my eyes for a moment, letting the weight of that settle in, letting his words land exactly where they were meant to. Then something else came through. Faint, unclear at first. Another voice in the background. I replayed it, leaning closer to the phone. Vanessa. "We need to finish everything before she gets back." The room went still. I didn't move, didn't breathe. I played it again and again. Each time the words settled deeper, clearer, more undeniable than before. I didn't need context. I didn't need a full sentence. The timing alone said everything. She knew. Before the paperwork, before the filing, before I even came back, she knew exactly what she was doing. I sent the file to Evelyn immediately. No explanation, no message, just the recording. Her response came back faster than anything before. "This changes the case. Not might, not could. Changes." By the time we met the next day, everything had shifted. We weren't just building an argument anymore. We were building impact. Evelyn laid it out clearly. We introduced the contract first, then the timeline, then the discrepancies. We let them stabilize. We let them believe they've explained it. And only then, we introduced the recording. "Not at the beginning," she said. "At the moment they think they've controlled the narrative." I nodded slowly, understanding exactly what that meant. Timing, not just in what happened, in how it's revealed. As I left her office, I felt something settle into place that hadn't been there before. Not anger, not relief, control. Vanessa had moved first, fast, confident, certain no one would challenge her. I was moving second, and I wasn't rushing. Because for the first time since this started, the timing wasn't hers anymore. It was mine. The courthouse didn't feel like a place where anything dramatic would happen. There were no raised voices, no tension hanging in the air the way people imagine. Just quiet hallways, controlled movement, and a system that continued forward whether anyone was ready or not. Evelyn walked beside me without speaking, her pace steady, her focus already ahead of the moment we were stepping into. "This isn't about emotion," she said softly as we reached the courtroom doors. "It's about sequence." I nodded once, because everything we had built came down to that. Vanessa was already inside. She looked exactly the way I expected, composed, prepared, her posture straight, her expression neutral, like she had rehearsed this version of herself long before today. Her attorney stood next to her, flipping through documents with quiet precision, occasionally leaning in to speak in low tones. When her eyes met mine, she smiled. Not warmly, not coldly, just enough to say she believed she was still in control. That belief stayed with her as the hearing began. Her attorney spoke first, laying out their position with practiced ease. The probate had been handled properly. The transfer followed procedure. No objections had been raised at the time. Everything aligned with legal standards. It sounded clean, structured, predictable. That was the intention. If something sounds routine, people stop questioning it. Evelyn didn't interrupt. She didn't react. She waited. When it was her turn, she didn't start with accusations. She started with agreement, acknowledging the timeline, confirming the sequence, letting their version stand just long enough to become visible. Then she narrowed it. Not everything, just specific points, the filing date, the document revisions, the contract. "This case is not about whether the paperwork was submitted," she said evenly. "It's about how and why it was submitted under these conditions." She introduced the contract first. Not as an argument, As context, a financial agreement tied to the property, conditional, time-sensitive, requiring full ownership. The judge reviewed it briefly, expression unchanged. Vanessa's attorney leaned forward, ready to respond, but Evelyn didn't pause. She moved into the timeline. Dates appeared one by one. The contract, the communications, the probate filing, each placed carefully, not rushed, not forced, just enough for the pattern to emerge on its own. Why did everything happen at the same time? Vanessa's attorney objected, calling the contract irrelevant. Evelyn didn't argue. She adjusted. Then let's focus on the documents, she said. The revised will, the altered signature, the metadata showing when the file had last been modified. She didn't accuse. She presented. This version did not exist at the time of the original signing. A pause followed. Small, controlled. But there. Vanessa leaned toward her attorney, whispering quickly. He responded with a measured explanation. Clerical updates, administrative corrections, standard adjustments. It sounded reasonable, but it didn't explain the timing, and Evelyn didn't let it. If these were standard corrections, she continued, why were they made within the same window as a contract requiring full ownership? The room shifted. Not visibly, but enough. Vanessa's confidence didn't disappear. It tightened, focused, less fluid. She wasn't losing control, but she was starting to feel it move. Evelyn paused. Not because she was finished, because she was choosing the moment. This is where intent becomes relevant, she said. She didn't introduce the recording. Not yet. Instead, she returned to the emails, the line about finalizing before additional parties were involved. She read it exactly as it appeared, then let it sit. Vanessa's attorney objected again. More forcefully this time, speculation, mischaracterization, lack of direct evidence. The judge acknowledged the limitation. Intent required stronger linkage. It sounded like a setback. It wasn't, because that was the opening. Evelyn nodded slightly. Understood, she said calmly. Then we will provide that linkage at the appropriate time. I felt it then. Not tension, not anxiety, just awareness. Everything was moving exactly where it needed to go. The hearing didn't end with a decision. It wasn't meant to. It ended with continuation, further review, additional examination, time. To anyone else, it might have looked balanced, unresolved. But as we stepped into the hallway, Evelyn turned to me. They think they stabilized it, she said. I didn't ask what she meant. They believe they've explained enough to hold the structure together. She paused. They're about to stop looking for what they missed. I understood. Vanessa thought the situation was contained, manageable, still within her control. She didn't realize the pressure had already started, and the part that would break it hadn't even been introduced yet. By the time the second hearing was called, the room felt different before anyone even spoke. It wasn't louder. It wasn't more crowded. But something had shifted. The air carried a kind of weight that hadn't been there before, like every person in that room knew this wasn't just a continuation. It was a turning point. Vanessa was already seated when I walked in. She looked sharper this time, more deliberate. Every detail controlled, from the way she sat to the way she held her hands together on the table. But there was something else now. Not visible at first. Not something most people would notice. Tension. Her attorney leaned close, speaking in low, precise tones, reviewing notes with a level of focus that hadn't been necessary before. They weren't dismissing anything anymore. They were preparing. Evelyn noticed it too. They felt the shift, she said quietly as we took our seats. I didn't respond. I didn't need to, because for the first time, Vanessa didn't look at me, not once. The hearing opened with her side again. This time, their argument wasn't about routine or simplicity. It was about legitimacy. They introduced additional documents, reinforcing every step of the probate process, framing each decision as compliant, each action as justified. They leaned into structure, procedure, the idea that everything had been done correctly. And for a moment, it sounded convincing. Because they had built it well. But it still relied on one thing, that the timeline could be explained. Evelyn let them finish. Every point, every explanation, every attempt to stabilize the narrative. She didn't interrupt. She didn't challenge. She waited until there was nothing left for them to add. Then she stood. "Let's revisit the timeline," she said. Not as repetition, as precision. She walked through it again. The contract, the communications, the document revisions. But this time it wasn't about proximity. It was about dependency. Each step didn't just happen near the others. It relied on the others. One action making the next possible. One decision forcing the next to follow. Vanessa's attorney interrupted, calling it circumstantial. Evelyn didn't resist. She allowed it. Then she asked one question. If these actions were independent, she said evenly, why do they rely on the same condition to be effective? Silence followed. Not empty, heavy. Vanessa leaned forward slightly, whispering again to her attorney, but this time he hesitated. Just for a moment, but long enough. Because hesitation in a room like that says more than confidence ever could. Evelyn didn't press. She shifted. "Your Honor," she said calmly, "we've established sequence, alignment, and dependency. What remains is intent." She paused, and then she reached for the file. "This recording was recovered from the decedent's personal device," she continued. "It has been authenticated and submitted for review." Vanessa's attorney objected immediately. Chain of custody, context, relevance. Evelyn didn't argue. She presented certification, verification, procedural compliance, everything already in place before the hearing began. The judge reviewed it briefly, then allowed it. Evelyn didn't rush. She waited until the room settled completely, until no one moved, until the moment felt still enough to hold what was coming. Then she pressed play. My father's voice filled the room, steady, tired, clear. He spoke about the land, about both daughters, about keeping things equal, about not letting anything change what had already been decided. The words settled slowly, like they belonged there, like they had been waiting. Then, near the end, another voice. Faint, but unmistakable. Vanessa. "We need to finish everything before she gets back." No one spoke. No one moved. The silence that followed wasn't confusion. It was recognition. Vanessa's expression didn't break immediately. It held. For a second longer than expected, like she was searching for a way to place what she had just heard back into something she could control. Then it shifted. Subtle, but enough. Her attorney began to respond, his voice steady, structured, attempting to reframe the recording as incomplete, lacking context, insufficient on its own. The words came out, but they didn't land. Because the room had already heard what it needed. Evelyn didn't interrupt. She didn't need to. The judge spoke after a moment, not with a final decision, not yet, but with acknowledgement. The evidence would be fully considered. The case would move to final review. It wasn't a verdict, but it was something else, a shift. As we stood to leave, I didn't look at Vanessa, and she didn't look at me. Not this time, because for the first time since I walked back into that house, the balance had changed in a way neither of us could undo. She wasn't managing the situation anymore. She was reacting to it. And the difference between those two states decides everything that comes next. The final ruling came without hesitation. The judge didn't raise his voice, didn't stretch the moment, didn't make it feel like a performance. He simply reviewed the sequence one last time, each piece placed exactly where it belonged, and then he spoke in a tone that left no space for interpretation. The probate transfer was invalid. The contract tied to full ownership was void. And the land, the only thing my father had left behind, was recognized as shared inheritance, exactly as he had intended. For a second, nothing moved. Vanessa sat still, her posture unchanged, her expression carefully held in place like she was trying to keep something from slipping. Her attorney leaned in, speaking quietly, outlining next steps, possible appeals, procedural options that sounded more like habit than strategy. Because even before the words were finished, it was clear. The structure she built was gone. Not damaged, gone. Then something unexpected happened. A man stood from the back of the room. I recognized him immediately, even though we had never spoken. He was the representative from the logistics company tied to the contract. He stepped forward, composed, professional, his presence quiet but deliberate. "Your Honor," he said. then turned slightly, addressing the room rather than the court. Our company has reviewed the situation in light of the ruling, he continued. We will not proceed under the previous agreement. Vanessa's hand tightened slightly on the edge of the table. It was the first real reaction I had seen from her all day. We require full transparency and verified ownership before entering any future negotiation, he added. Then his gaze shifted, not toward Vanessa, toward me. If you're open to discussion, he said, we would be interested in working with you directly. There was no emphasis in his voice, no attempt to make the moment bigger than it was. But it didn't need it, because everything Vanessa had built her plan around, the urgency, the control, the certainty that she could secure that deal before anyone noticed, had just been removed from her reach in the same room where she thought she had secured it. She didn't look at me when we left, not in the hallway, not outside, not even when we passed each other one last time near the parking lot. Whatever she was holding on to, whatever version of control she had left, it wasn't something she could project anymore. Because there was nothing left to manage, only consequences. I didn't stop her. I didn't say anything. There was no need. Some endings don't need confrontation. They need distance. A few weeks later, I stood on the land again. The same dry stretch of ground that had been dismissed as worthless, ignored until someone realized its timing, its position, its potential. But now it felt different. Not because it had changed, because I had. Survey lines cut across the dirt in clean, measured paths. Markers stood where nothing had stood before. The highway expansion had already begun in the distance, machines moving slowly, deliberately, reshaping everything around it. Change wasn't coming. It was already here. Evelyn had finalized the next steps with the company. New agreements, clear terms, no hidden conditions. Everything documented the way it should have been from the beginning. And for the first time, I wasn't reacting to something someone else had set in motion. I was deciding what came next. That was the part no one talks about when they think about revenge. It isn't loud. It isn't explosive. It doesn't come from anger. It comes from clarity, from understanding exactly what was taken, how it was taken, and choosing not just to get it back, but to rebuild it in a way no one else can take again. Vanessa thought owning everything would secure her future. She didn't realize that how you get something matters just as much as what you get. Because in the end, she lost both. And I didn't win because I fought harder. I won because I didn't rush, because I waited, because I let the truth surface at the exact moment it couldn't be ignored. If you've ever been in a place where someone made you feel like you had nothing, like your voice didn't matter, like the outcome had already been decided without you, then you understand this kind of silence. It isn't weakness, it's timing. So tell me this. Would you have spoken up right away, or would you have waited the way I did? I read every comment, and stories like yours matter more than you think. And if you believe that patience, truth, and knowing your worth still matter in a world that tries to rush everything, stay here with me. There's always another story waiting, and sometimes the quiet ones are the ones that change everything. This story is fictional. Any resemblance to real people or events is purely coincidental.